Everyone escaped the battlefield. Only one human stood between the Queen and death. The ridge was already burning when I gave the order to fall back. I did not hesitate. I want to make that clear, because in the years that followed, many beings would ask me whether I hesitated, whether some instinct told me to stay, whether I felt shame in that moment. The answer is no. I gave the order, because the math was simple, and the outcome was certain, and a commander who ignores simple math and certain outcomes is not a commander. He is a monument waiting to be built. My name is Kael'Rath. I hold the rank of Field Commander in the Vethari Coalition Ground Forces. I have led soldiers across 17 campaigns on 9 different worlds. I have won more than I have lost. I have lost more than I like to remember. And I have spent 40 years learning the difference between a fight that can be won and a fight that only costs you more dead before you accept the same result. Yisan Prime was the second kind of fight. The brood arrived without warning, which is the only way they ever arrive. One moment, our long-range sensors showed clear space above the planet. The next, the sky filled with their vessels. Long, dark, irregular shapes that moved like living things rather than machines. Because they were living things. Because everything the brood builds is alive and hungry and pointed in one direction, toward us. Our coalition force numbered 42 warships and 3 full ground divisions. The Vethari contributed the largest portion, as we almost always do. The Drenhari brought their 3rd battalion, which had a fine reputation, and earned it. The Sorath fielded 2 companies of their heavy-suit infantry, slow but nearly impossible to stop in open terrain. And then there were the smaller contributions, individual units, liaison teams, observers from species whose militaries were still new to coalition operations. That last category included a single human. I did not think much about her at the time. She was attached to my command as a liaison observer, which is a polite way of saying that her government had sent her to watch what a real military operation looked like. Humans had been part of the coalition for 11 years. They were enthusiastic, they asked good questions, they worked hard, but they were young as a spacefaring species, and their military doctrine was still being adapted to the scale and complexity of coalition warfare. An observer role was standard for a species at their stage of development. Her name was Dara Vasquez. She was a sergeant first class in something called the United Earth Marine Corps. She was of average height for a human female, which made her shorter than everyone else on my command staff. She had dark eyes that moved constantly, not nervously, but with the sharp, scanning quality of someone who was always measuring distances and angles without thinking about it. She asked me twice, in our first week of operations, whether she could accompany forward scouting units instead of staying at command. I said no both times. She accepted my decision without argument, which I respected. I did not know her well. I did not need to. She was an observer, not a combatant, or so I believed. The brood's initial strike hit our orbital defense layer first. 3 of our warships came apart in the first exchange. Another 2 lost engine capability and began drifting. Our fleet commander, Admiral Vesseran, made the decision to draw the fleet back to the outer defensive line, which was the correct decision and one that would haunt him for the rest of his career, because it left the ground forces exposed faster than anyone had planned for. On the surface, the null-tide weapon discharged at 14 minutes past the initial contact. I had heard about the null-tide weapon. Every coalition commander had heard about it. Reports from the Drenhari border skirmishes 18 months earlier had described it in technical terms, an energy pulse that disrupted the molecular cohesion of energy-based shielding systems, rendering them ineffective for a period of 40 to 60 minutes, depending on shield type and exposure duration. The reports had classified it as a serious threat, requiring updated countermeasures, and suggested a working group be formed to study potential responses. What the reports had not conveyed, and what no working group could adequately prepare you for, was the experience of watching 42 shield generators fail simultaneously. The sound alone was unlike anything I had heard in 17 campaigns. It was not an explosion. It was more like a silence that arrived too suddenly, a gap where a constant background hum used to live, and then the screaming began almost immediately afterward, because the soldiers who had been standing near shield emitters when they discharged were not in good condition. I had 17 seconds between the null-tide discharge and the brood ground forces reaching our forward line. In those 17 seconds, I made every calculation I could. Without shields, Our infantry was exposed to direct brood contact, and brood contact at scale is not a fight. It is a consumption. The brood do not maneuver, and do not negotiate, and do not stop. They advance, and they overwhelm, and they consume. And the only effective counter to a large brood ground force in open terrain is sustained energy weapon fire from behind shielded positions, which we no longer had. We could not hold the line. We could not hold any line. Our options were to retreat or to be consumed. There was one additional factor, which was the reason we were on Eson Prime in the first place. Queen Sarath Voss, the ruling sovereign of the Vethari conclave and the political anchor of the entire coalition, was on the surface. Her diplomatic visit to Eson Prime had been scheduled for 6 months. Security had been thorough. The possibility of a brood incursion at this precise location and time had been assessed as extremely low, which is the kind of assessment that looks foolish in retrospect, and perfectly reasonable in the moment. When the brood arrived, the Queen's security detail moved her immediately to an underground bunker beneath the main diplomatic complex. The bunker was solid, 10 meters of reinforced composite above her, emergency life support, communication relays, a small but capable personal guard under the command of a veteran officer named Keth Voren. She was safe for the moment. The extraction shuttle was 14 minutes away. It was a heavy Vethari atmospheric craft, shielded against standard brood projectiles, fast enough to get in and get out before the brood could bring their larger weapons to bear on a surface target. All the Queen needed to do was survive for 14 minutes, and then she would be aboard the shuttle, and then she would be above the atmosphere, and then she would be alive. The problem was the ridge. The Karath Ridge ran east to west, approximately 2 kilometers north of the diplomatic complex. It was elevated terrain, not dramatically so, perhaps 40 meters above the surrounding plain, but it represented the only significant natural obstacle between the brood advance and the bunker entrance. If the brood crossed the ridge uncontested, they would reach the bunker approach in under 4 minutes. If they reached the bunker approach in force before the shuttle arrived, the Queen's Guard would hold them for perhaps 3 minutes before being overwhelmed. The math produced a gap of 7 minutes. 7 minutes between the brood crossing the ridge and the shuttle arriving. 7 minutes during which the Queen would have nothing between her and the brood except a locked door and the determination of a small guard unit that I had already calculated would not survive the contact. 7 minutes is a long time to need and a short time to have. I gave the evacuation order. Every ground unit began falling back toward the emergency landing zones to the south, where coalition shuttles were already descending to collect them. The retreat was not panicked. My soldiers were trained, and they moved with discipline. But it was fast, and it covered ground quickly, and within 9 minutes, the forward positions were empty. The Drenhari 3rd Battalion was the last organized unit to pull back. Their commander, a steady officer named Ves Han, looked at the sensor display as he passed through my command position and said nothing, because the sensor display said everything that needed to be said. The brood were 4 minutes from the ridge. The Queen's shuttle was 12 minutes out. No coalition soldiers remained between those two facts. I watched the tactical display as the last of my units cleared the extraction zone. The sensor overlay showed the brood advance, a dense mass of thermal signatures moving north across the plain like a slow tide that nothing was going to stop. Above it, the empty sky, where our warships had been. Below it, the small blue marker that indicated the Queen's bunker. And then I noticed something that should not have been there. A single life sign, small, faint by comparison to the brood signatures, but unmistakable on a scan, calibrated for coalition biology. It was not moving south with the retreating units. It was not moving at all, for a moment, and then it began moving north, toward the ridge. I stared at that single marker for longer than I should have, because my mind did not immediately produce an explanation that fit my understanding of rational behavior. Units retreated south. The brood advanced north. There was no logical reason for any coalition soldier to be moving north toward a position that was about to be occupied by thousands of hostile brood. My communications officer, a young Vethari named Tor, was already checking the identification code. He looked up from his console with an expression I could not immediately name. "Commander, the life sign is human." I understood the identification before he finished the sentence, because there was only one human in my command. "Vasquez," I said. "Yes, sir." I pulled up her personnel file out of reflex, as though something in it would explain what I was seeing. There was not much to it. 11 years of service with the United Earth Marine Corps, multiple deployments, several commendations for conduct under fire. A notation from her unit's commanding officer describing her as, and I am translating loosely from the human language here, someone who always runs toward the sound rather than away from it. I had read that notation when she was assigned to my command. I had not understood it as a literal description of her behavior. I reached for the communication channel. Vasquez, this is Field Commander Kaelrath. You are moving in the wrong direction. All units are withdrawing south. Confirm your position and redirect immediately. Static. Then her voice, calm and low, with the particular quality of someone who is concentrating on something else while they speak to you. I hear you, Commander. I know which direction I'm moving. The brood will reach that ridge in under 4 minutes. If you are on it when they arrive. I know, she said. 2 words. No elaboration. The kind of answer that does not invite further argument, because it is not an answer at all. It is a statement of awareness, which is entirely different. She was not confused. She was not panicked. She was not in error. She knew exactly where she was going, and exactly what was going to happen when she got there, and she was going anyway. I sat with that for a moment. 40 years of military command teaches you many things. It teaches you logistics and tactics, and the particular fatigue that comes from making decisions that cost other people. It teaches you how to read a battle line, and how to know when a position is lost before your subordinates have accepted it. It teaches you the difference between courage and recklessness, between sacrifice and waste. What it had not taught me, until that moment, was how to respond to a being who had done all the same calculations I had done, arrived at the same conclusions I had arrived at, and then decided that the conclusions were not the final answer. I watched her marker reach the base of the ridge and begin climbing. Commander, Tor's voice was careful. Shall I continue trying to raise her? I thought about it. I genuinely did not know the answer. Ordering her back was the rational command decision. She was one soldier, trained as an observer, not a frontline combatant, and the situation on that ridge was not survivable for a single combatant of any species. Ordering her back was also the correct thing to do by every standard of military responsibility. A commander does not leave soldiers to die on a position that cannot be held. But she was already at the ridge. She was already deploying, and the brood were 3 minutes away. And the Queen's shuttle was 12 minutes away. And no one else was between those 2 things. No, I said. Do not raise her. Get me a sensor lock on her position. Real time. I want to see everything. Tor looked at me for exactly 1 second. Then he turned back to his console and did as I had asked. The shuttle I was aboard lifted from the surface 30 seconds later and began climbing toward the outer atmosphere, where the fleet was regrouping beyond the brood's immediate strike range. Around me, my command staff worked their stations, managing the evacuation feeds, tracking unit positions, coordinating with the orbital elements. I watched the sensor display. Dara Vasquez reached the top of the ridge with 2 minutes to spare before the brood forward scouts arrived. I watched her heat signature settle into a stationary position, not crouched in retreat, not moving toward cover on the south face. She was on the crest, in the open, facing north. She was setting up a firing position. A firing position. One human soldier with a rifle, establishing a defensive position on a ridge that was about to receive thousands of brood. My tactical officer, Os, had been running the same sensor data and arrived at the same image. She spoke without looking up from her console, and her voice was very quiet. She cannot stop them, Os said. No, I agreed. She cannot even slow them significantly. The brood mass is too large. One rifle, even sustained fully automatic fire, will not reduce their advance speed by any measurable. She is not trying to stop them, I said. Os looked at me. She is trying to delay them, I said. There is a difference. I had run the numbers before Os had finished her sentence, because that is what commanders do. If Vasquez could create enough disruption at the ridge to force the brood forward elements to slow and respond to her position, she might buy 3 to 4 minutes before the advance resumed at full speed. 3 to 4 minutes added to the approach time reduced the gap from 7 minutes to 3 or 4. Not 0. Not safe, but smaller. She was not calculating survival. She was calculating time, and she had found some. 3 minutes. She was spending herself to create 3 minutes. I have 17 words in Vethari for different types of military sacrifice. Some are honored, some are necessary, some are both. None of them fully captured what I was watching. The brood scouts hit the northern slope of the ridge. Dara Vasquez opened fire. The sound reached our sensors a fraction of a second later, a rapid, precise rhythm, each shot distinct, each one placed with deliberate accuracy. I watched brood thermal signatures drop, one after another, in the first rank of the advance. The column behind them compressed, which was exactly what she had intended. A compressed column is slower than a spread advance. A compressed column that has taken fire from an elevated position redirects part of its force toward that position, which takes more time. She was buying seconds with every shot, seconds that were becoming minutes. On the sensor display, the Queen's bunker marker pulsed blue and steady. 12 minutes, now 11. On the ridge, one small orange dot held its position and kept firing. I realized, sitting in my command shuttle with 40 years of military experience and 17 different words for sacrifice, that I was watching something I did not have a word for. I kept watching. The ridge held. She held. And the seconds kept becoming minutes, and the minutes kept becoming the gap that the Queen needed. And somewhere in the math that I had already calculated as impossible, one human being was finding numbers that I had missed. I did not look away from that sensor display for the next 11 minutes. I am not ashamed of that. It was the most important thing I have ever watched. The brood kept coming. She kept shooting. And for 11 minutes, the universe held its breath and let one person be more than the math said she should be. It was the most remarkable thing I have ever seen, and it was only the beginning. I will try to explain what the brood are, for anyone reading this account who has not encountered them in person, because understanding what Dara Vasquez faced on that ridge requires understanding what she was facing. The brood are not an army in any sense that a civilized species would recognize. They are not a collection of individuals who have been organized and trained and equipped. They are something older and simpler, and in many ways more frightening than that. They are a single organism expressed across millions of bodies, each one connected to a shared directive that operates like an instinct rather than a command structure. There is no leader to target, no headquarters to destroy, no supply line to cut. The brood advance because that is what the brood does, the way water descends because that is what water does. They are also extraordinarily difficult to stop with conventional weapons at scale. Each individual brood soldier, if you can call it a soldier, is approximately 2 meters long, 6-limbed, covered in a natural carapace that deflects standard projectile fire at anything less than close range. Their speed across open ground is significant. Their response to casualties is essentially zero. They do not slow when their forward ranks are reduced. They do not become afraid. They do not reconsider their approach based on the evidence in front of them. They simply continue, because that is the directive, and the directive does not update based on local conditions. To hold a position against the brood with conventional weapons, you need prepared fortifications, overlapping fields of fire, energy weapons capable of penetrating the carapace at range, and enough soldiers to maintain continuous fire across the entire front. Without any one of those elements, the position falls. Without all of them, the position falls quickly. Dara Vasquez had a rifle, a sidearm, 2 anti-armor charges, 11 magazines of standard coalition ammunition, and a knife. She had no fortifications except the natural shape of the ridge. She had no overlapping fields of fire, because there was only her. She had no energy weapons. She had no other soldiers. By every framework I had ever been taught, by every calculation my 40 years of experience could produce, she should not have been able to hold that ridge for 40 seconds. She held it for 11 minutes and 23 seconds. I have spent a great deal of time, in the years since Yisan Prime, trying to understand how. The tactical answer is that she was extraordinarily skilled, that she identified and exploited the specific vulnerabilities of a brood column approaching elevated terrain, that she used every round with maximum efficiency and every second with maximum awareness. Those things are all true. But they are not the whole answer. The whole answer requires acknowledging something that military doctrine does not easily accommodate, which is this. There are moments when a single individual, through some combination of will and skill and refusal, exceeds what the numbers say they should be able to do. It does not happen often. When it does, the numbers are not wrong. They simply did not account for everything. They did not account for her. I watched her hold that ridge for 11 minutes and 23 seconds, and I watched the Queen's shuttle descend and reach the bunker and lift away with its cargo intact. And I watched the brood finally overwhelm the position and wash over the ridge like a tide that had been held back for just long enough. And then I did something that no one expected me to do. I told my pilot to take us down. Not to the extraction zone. Not to the fleet rendezvous point. Down to the ridge. My officers tried to tell me it was too dangerous. They were correct. I overruled them anyway, because there was one life sign still on that ridge, and it was not moving, and I needed to know. I needed to see. What I found there changed how I understood the word courage for the rest of my life. But that is what comes next. The sensors on my command shuttle were the best available in the Coalition fleet. They could detect a single heartbeat through 3 meters of reinforced composite. They could distinguish between 17 different Coalition species by biosignature alone. They had been calibrated and recalibrated by the finest technical crews the Vethari military could provide. And for 11 minutes, they had been showing me something that none of their calibrations had prepared them to explain. Let me back up, because the story of those 11 minutes is not only Dara Vasquez's story, even though she was the one on the ridge. Part of it happened aboard my command shuttle, in the silence between sensor readings, in the space between what my training told me and what my eyes were showing me. When she opened fire on the brood advance, the initial burst of shots was so precise that my tactical officer Os stopped mid-sentence and did not finish it. Os had been in the process of explaining, for the third time, why the position was not sustainable. She had a gift for stating the obvious with great technical authority, which made her an excellent analyst and occasionally a difficult conversation partner. When Vasquez's first shots dropped the 6 lead brood scouts in 6 consecutive seconds, Os simply stopped speaking and looked at the display. 6 shots, 6 targets, each one at a different range, each one placed in the specific gap between carapace segments where Coalition ammunition could achieve penetration, at distance, in wind, against moving targets, under the awareness that thousands more were behind those 6. Os did not finish her sentence about the position being unsustainable. I watched the brood column compress as the forward elements slowed to process the new obstacle. This is a consistent behavior pattern in brood ground advances. When the forward scouts encounter sustained resistance from an elevated position, the column compresses while the flanking directive engages. Part of the mass redirects toward the high ground while the rest maintains pressure toward the original objective. It is effective because it forces the defending position to address threats from multiple angles simultaneously, and most defending positions cannot do that without support. Vasquez appeared to know this was coming. She shifted her fire before the flanking movement was clearly established on my sensors. She identified it before we did, which should not have been possible from ground level with the naked eye. But there are certain things that experienced infantry soldiers develop that do not translate well into sensor readouts. A feel for the ground, an awareness of how a mass of bodies moves when it changes direction, a kind of peripheral understanding that processes information faster than conscious thought. She redirected her fire toward the left flank, and the left flank slowed. She anticipated the flanking move, Os said quietly. Yes? How? Experience, I said, and probably something we don't have a word for. My communications specialist, a young Vethari named Sorath, was monitoring the frequency on which Vasquez's personal equipment transmitted. It was a Coalition standard frequency, and her suit's systems broadcast continuous telemetry. Heart rate, blood pressure, respiratory rate, body temperature, joint stress indicators. We were receiving all of it in real time. Sorath read the numbers quietly at first, as part of her routine monitoring, and then she stopped reading them quietly and said, in a voice that was several registers lower than her normal speaking voice, "Commander, her heart rate. What about it?" "It is 62 beats per minute." I looked at her. "She has been under sustained fire contact for 4 minutes, Sorath said. "She is engaging thousands of brood. The sensor confirms she has been struck twice by debris from near impacts. Her left shoulder shows elevated stress indicators, consistent with minor impact injury." Sorath paused. "Her heart rate is 62 beats per minute. I know Vethari combat physiology well. Under stress, a Vethari warrior's heart rate elevates to somewhere between 120 and 140 beats per minute. Our adrenal equivalent floods the system and sharpens reaction time while reducing higher-order processing, which is the biological trade-off that combat physiology requires. We are faster and stronger, and less capable of complex reasoning, which works for most combat situations, because most combat situations do not require complex reasoning. 62 beats per minute was below the Vethari resting rate. Is the sensor malfunctioning? I asked. I checked that, Sorath said. It is not malfunctioning. I turned back to the tactical display. Vasquez's marker was still on the ridge crest. She had not moved from her firing position. The brood advance had reached the northern slope and was climbing. The compressed mass had spread again into a wider approach to try to reduce the impact of concentrated fire from the high point, which was a reasonable tactical adaptation. She had adapted with it, spreading her targeting across the wider front without reducing the precision of her shots. She is slowing them, Oz said, and this time there was no qualifier after it. No slightly, or temporarily, or without meaningful long-term impact. She was slowing them, the data said so. The gap between the brood's current position and the bunker was wider than it should have been 6 minutes into the advance, and the reason for that gap was one human being at the top of a ridge. Tor, my communications officer, was tracking the extraction shuttle separately. Shuttle is 8 minutes out, Commander. Descending through upper atmosphere now. 8 minutes. Vasquez had bought us 3 minutes already. She needed 5 more. I watched the display and tried to calculate the likelihood of 5 more minutes. The numbers were not kind. She had expended approximately 40% of her ammunition by my estimate, based on the rate of fire and the time elapsed. The brood force reaching the slope was significantly larger than the initial column, because brood advances aggregate. More units drawn from adjacent areas by the signal of resistance, pulled toward the obstacle the way water is pulled toward a drain. She was not facing the same force she had faced 4 minutes ago. She was facing a larger one. Her heart rate was 62 beats per minute. I found myself thinking about humans, not in the abstract, diplomatic way I had thought about them during coalition meetings, but specifically, biologically, as a species. I had read the standard cultural and physiological briefings when they joined the coalition. I knew the broad outlines. They were from a high-gravity world with large seasonal temperature variations. They had evolved in conditions that required them to adapt to a wide range of physical stressors. Their healing rate was slower than most species, but their endurance under sustained physical stress was notably high. Something about the particular chemistry of their muscular and metabolic systems that allowed them to continue functioning at significant output levels long after other species would have been forced to stop. They also felt pain fully. This was in the briefings. They had no neurological mechanism to suppress pain signals during high-stress situations. Every injury registered completely and continuously. They functioned through it, rather than around it, which the briefing had noted as a remarkable characteristic, without fully explaining why it was remarkable. Sitting in my command shuttle watching Dara Vasquez hold a ridge against thousands of brood, while registering every hit and every bruise and every impact in full, I understood why it was remarkable. Second anti-armor charge deployed, Sorath said. The sensor showed a concentrated heat bloom on the right flank, where the brood had been making their most significant progress toward the ridgeline. The bloom was followed by a pause in movement on that flank, perhaps 40 seconds, perhaps a little more, while the brood units nearest the impact reorganized. 40 seconds. I watched Vasquez's marker shift. She was moving, not retreating, adjusting. She relocated 20 meters along the ridge crest to a new position, one that gave her better angle on the left flank where pressure was now greatest. She was reading the advance in real time and repositioning to address the most immediate threat. Tor. Shuttle is 6 minutes out. Os. Brood forward elements are 45 seconds from the ridge crest. Sorath. She's switching to sidearm. The rifle appears to have jammed or run empty. I leaned forward. A sidearm is a personal defense weapon. It is not a suppression weapon. It is not a weapon you use to slow a mass advance. It is a weapon you use when everything else is gone, and the threat is very close, and you are trying to buy yourself the next 3 seconds, rather than the next 3 minutes. She had switched to a sidearm, while the brood were 45 seconds from her position. And then, I still think about this moment, the sidearm fire started. Not panicked, not rapid to the point of imprecision. She was firing the same way she had fired the rifle. Measured, Placed. Each shot at a specific target for a specific purpose. She's targeting the lead elements, Oz said, and there was something in her voice now that I had never heard from Oz in 9 years of working together. She's not trying to stop them. She's trying to keep them focused on her position, rather than splitting toward the bunker approach. That was exactly right. A brood advance will sometimes fracture when it encounters persistent resistance from a single point. The portion of the advance closest to the point concentrates on eliminating the resistance, while the outer portions continue toward the original objective. If the resistance stops, if the defender goes silent, the outer portions are no longer diverted. They redirect. If she stopped firing, even for 30 seconds, a significant part of the brood mass would peel away from the ridge and move directly toward the bunker with nothing to slow it. She was not firing to survive. She was firing to be a problem that had to be addressed. She was being so specifically and consistently troublesome that the brood could not ignore her and move on. She was making herself the most important thing on the battlefield by being impossible to dismiss. Tor, shuttle is 4 minutes out. Sorath. Her left arm telemetry has gone abnormal. Significant stress indicators. Possible structural injury. She kept firing. I have commanded soldiers for 40 years. I have asked soldiers to hold positions under fire. I have asked soldiers to continue advancing when they wanted to stop. I have asked soldiers to maintain discipline when every instinct said to break and run. I have never asked any soldier to do what Dara Vasquez was doing in that moment, because it would not have occurred to me that it could be asked. You do not ask someone to be a fixed point against thousands. You do not ask someone to be the anchor that holds while the tide comes in. You do not ask a single living creature to be the wall. She had not been asked. She had looked at the same situation I had looked at, and she had asked herself. Sorath spoke again, and her voice was careful in the way that voices become when the speaker is trying to keep them from doing something other than reporting. Her heart rate has changed, Commander. What is it now? 58. I said nothing. It went down, under fire, with a broken arm, with thousands closing in, with the weight of everything she was carrying in that moment. Her heart rate went down. Tor. Shuttle is 3 minutes out, beginning final approach. Bunker is responding to docking signal. 3 minutes. She had done it. Not completely. 3 minutes of brood advance still stood between the Queen and safety, but she had compressed the gap from 7 minutes to 3, and 3 minutes was something the Queen's guard could address. 3 minutes was a door that could be held, a corridor that could be defended with the resources available inside the bunker. 3 minutes was survivable. But the ridge was no longer survivable. The brood forward elements crested the ridge on both sides of her position almost simultaneously. The sensor showed her marker surrounded, the larger signatures closing from 3 directions. I watched Oz tracking the same data, and I watched Oz not say anything, because there was nothing to say. Sorath. Her sidearm appears to have gone empty. She has transitioned to... Sorath checked the data. To her knife. Tor. Shuttle is 2 minutes out. A knife. She was using a knife. I want to be very careful about how I describe this, because it is important, and it is something that I have tried to explain to a great many beings in the years since Yisan Prime, and it is something that most of them do not immediately understand. The reason she was using a knife was not that she had lost her ability to think clearly. It was not desperation, or panic, or the kind of instinctive, uncontrolled behavior that beings sometimes exhibit when they are overwhelmed. She was using a knife because it was the best tool she had left, and she was using it with the same precision and deliberateness with which she had used every other tool she had. It was the most rational thing in the world, and it was somehow the most extraordinary thing I had ever seen. The sensor showed her life sign holding steady, still on the ridge, still stationary, which meant she had not been forced from her position, still registering vital signs that indicated consciousness and function. Heart rate, 58. 1 minute to shuttle arrival. I had already made the decision before I consciously thought it through. I told my pilot to take the command shuttle down. My security detail objected. Tor objected. Oz did not object, because Oz had been watching the same display and had reached her own conclusions. The extraction zone is 3 kilometers south, my pilot said. Yes, I said. Take us to the ridge. Commander, the brood are occupied, I said. Take us to the ridge. Now. He took us to the ridge. Tor. Shuttle has landed at the bunker. Queen Sereth Voss is aboard. lifting in 90 seconds. The Queen was safe, and we were descending toward the last place on Yisan Prime that anyone rational would choose to descend toward, because there was one life sign on that ridge, and it had not flatlined, and I was going to find out what was still attached to it. My shuttle dropped below the ridgeline. The brood swarmed on both sides of us. They do not respond immediately to aerial vehicles unless the vehicle attacks them, which ours did not. We came in low and fast, and the pilot was very good. What the cameras showed as we descended was not what I had expected. Not because she was in worse shape than the sensors had suggested. She was in bad shape. The left arm wrapped in bloody field dressing, her position reduced to a shallow hollow in the rock, that she had made somewhat defensible with the bodies of the brood she had already brought down. Not because the situation around her was less severe than I had calculated. The brood were within meters and closing. What I had not expected was the expression on her face. I saw it on the camera feed before we landed. She was looking north, toward the mass still coming, and she was not afraid. She was not defiant in the dramatic sense, with the clenched jaw and wide eyes of someone performing courage for an audience. She looked the way a craftsman looks when they are finishing a piece of work, focused, present, tired in the bones, and completely certain about what they are doing. The shuttle touched down. My personal guard went out first. I followed. She looked at me when I came around the nose of the shuttle. Her sidearm was in her right hand. She had found a dropped magazine somewhere in the chaos, and reloaded it without my sensors catching the moment. Her left arm was at her side, and I could see from the angle it held that something in it was broken. Her uniform was damaged across the left shoulder and the upper chest. Her face was covered in dust, and one long scratch across her jaw that had bled and dried. Her eyes were completely calm. I stood in front of her, and I did not know what to say. I am a field commander with 40 years of experience. I have been in many difficult conversations. I have never stood in front of a single soldier and found that my entire vocabulary felt insufficient. She spoke first. "Took you long enough," she said. Her voice was steady. I made the Vethari gesture of deep honor and bowed my head, because I could not think of anything else appropriate to do, and because it was the truest response I had. "An approximation," I said, when she asked if it was a bow. She exhaled. Her right hand lowered the sidearm to her side, and I noticed it did not shake. She looked out at the plain to the north, where the brood were already being drawn by the departure signal from the Queen's shuttle. A larger target now, moving, and the brood redirect to movement. The pressure on the ridge eased as the mass shifted north and east. "The Queen?" she asked. "Aboard the extraction shuttle. Lifting now." She nodded. A single, small nod, the way someone nods when they have been waiting for a piece of information, and it arrives exactly as they expected it to. "Good," she said. "Just that." "Good." I helped her to the shuttle myself. I did not ask for her permission, and she did not object. She sat in the crew compartment and leaned her head back against the hull and closed her eyes, and her breathing was slow and even, and her heart rate, when Sorath confirmed it from the telemetry, was 54 beats per minute, falling. She was already asleep before we cleared the atmosphere. I sat across from her and watched the planet's surface fall away below us, and thought about everything I had just witnessed. I thought about the 17 words in Vethari for sacrifice, and how not one of them was quite right. I thought about the briefings that described humans as young and enthusiastic and still adapting to coalition-scale warfare. I thought about a heart rate of 58 beats per minute, and I began, slowly and carefully, to revise every assumption I had ever made about what a human being was capable of. The wind on the ridge smelled like copper and something older. The deep, wet smell of the planet itself, disturbed by fire and movement, and the particular kind of disruption that comes when millions of things that should not be here arrive all at once. I had been on the ridge for 2 minutes before the first brood scout crested the northern slope. 2 minutes is longer than it sounds when you are using every second of it. I had identified 3 positions before settling on the one I chose, the shallow depression behind the cracked granite outcrop at the ridge's highest point, which gave me a downward angle across most of the northern approach and partial cover from the east. I had ranged 6 target points and noted them in the way I had been trained to, the way that becomes instinct after enough repetitions, distances locked in by eye and verified by the scope's rangefinder. I had confirmed the wind direction twice. I had checked my ammunition count, separated my magazines into 2 groups based on distance, the heavier loaded ones for the far targets, the standard ones for when the range closed, and set both anti-armor charges where I could reach them with my right hand without looking. 2 minutes. I used every second. My name is Dara Vasquez. I have been a soldier for 11 years, and before that I grew up in a city in central Mexico where my grandmother told me, every single morning for 18 years, that the body can do anything the mind refuses to stop. She said it because she had lived through things that should have stopped her and had not. She said it the way other people say good morning. Not as a lesson but as a fact, the way you might note that the sun rises east. I repeated it to myself as I settled into the firing position. Not because I needed the reminder, but because it was her voice, and her voice made me feel like the world was a manageable size. The first brood scout appeared at 860 meters, moving fast across open ground. I exhaled. I had learned long ago that the breath is everything, not just the mechanics of it, the controlled release that steadies the body, but the philosophy of it. A slow breath is a decision. It says, I am choosing this. I am not reacting. I am acting. There is a difference, and the difference lives entirely in the breath. I put the first shot exactly where it needed to go. The scout dropped. The second appeared almost immediately, 20 meters to the left, moving at an angle that suggested it had not yet processed what had happened to the first. That is the thing about the brood's forward scouts. They are fast and they are precise, and they have excellent sensory capabilities, but they are not flexible. They operate on directive, and the directive does not update in real time from local events. They continue until the collective signal tells them to do otherwise. That delay is a gap. Gaps are opportunities. I used the gap. By the time the column behind the scouts began to compress, the behavior that brood advances always show when they encounter sustained resistance from elevation, I had brought down 11 forward elements, and was already adjusting my angle for the flanking movement I had been expecting since the second scout fell. You learn to read a mass advance. It is not complicated once you understand that large groups of anything move with predictable patterns. Water finds the low ground. Wind follows pressure gradients. The brood fan toward resistance from both sides, because the outer elements are not directly engaged, and continue on objective, while the inner elements address the obstacle. The flanking movement was going to come from the left first, because the terrain on the left approach was slightly more gradual, which the brood's advanced mechanics would identify faster than a human tactical officer reading sensor data would. I was already aiming left before the flank began to move. My left shoulder had taken a fragment from a rock impact somewhere in the first 3 minutes. I had not looked at it because looking would have taken time and information I did not need yet. I could feel that the arm still worked. The pain was sharp and clear and located rather than deep and spreading, which told me it was surface damage rather than structural. My grandmother would have said, the body tells you what it needs to tell you, and then it gets out of the way. She was not entirely wrong. I will be honest about what I was thinking during those minutes, because I think the honest answer is more interesting than the composed one. I was not thinking about the Queen. I was not thinking about the coalition, or the war, or the political consequences of what would happen if the ridge fell before the shuttle arrived. I was not thinking about any of it. I was thinking about the ridge. Specifically, I was thinking about the next 15 seconds. That is the temporal distance that combat compresses to. Not the next hour, not the next minute. 15 seconds, sometimes 10, because 10 seconds is about how far ahead a situation can be read with any useful accuracy. When the situation is moving at full speed, you plan for the 15 seconds ahead, you execute the 10 seconds ahead, and you let the rest take care of itself. This is not detachment, it is focus. There is a difference. My ammunition count was in my head the whole time, running as a background process, the way breathing runs as a background process. When the rifle went dry at the 9th magazine, I did not think about it. My hands were already moving before the thought formed, the empty magazine dropping, the fresh one seating, the bolt cycling, and then I was back on the target. The brood were on the slope now. The slope changed the calculus significantly. When they are on open ground, you have time and angle. When they hit the slope, the angle flattens, and they cover distance faster, because the slope channels their movement toward you. The position that had been excellent at 800 meters became less excellent at 200 meters, and the position at 50 meters is not really a position anymore. It is a choice. I deployed the first anti-armor charge at the left flank when they were 120 meters out and climbing fast. The charge is designed for vehicle armor, but the blast radius in enclosed terrain does significant work against massed infantry, or whatever the brood equivalent is. The explosion was loud enough that the world went briefly white in both ears, and I felt the pressure of it in my chest like a struck bell. 40 seconds of disruption on the left flank. I used the 40 seconds. Repositioned 20 meters east along the ridge. The new position gave me better angle on the right, which had become the more immediate problem. The right flank elements were moving more carefully than the left had. They had watched the left get hit, and the collective was learning, redirecting the approach angle to reduce the profile. Smarter. Slower. Still coming. Still coming is the only thing that matters, in the end. My rifle locked open on the 11th magazine. I transitioned to the sidearm without pausing, because a pause is a choice, and that was not the choice I was making. The sidearm has a shorter effective range and lower penetration, which means you have to be more selective with shot placement. The carapace gaps are smaller at the angles a sidearm provides, and you need to be closer to find them, which means you are also closer to everything else. Closer is not better, but it was what I had. The second anti-armor charge went on the right side when the nearest elements were 60 meters out. The blast was closer than I would have preferred, and the backwash hit me across the right side hard enough to knock me flat against the rock. I came back up with dirt in my eyes, and the sidearm still in my hand, and the world ringing in a way that was going to be someone else's problem to fix later. My left arm was not working the way it should have been. I had felt the moment it stopped working correctly. A specific kind of failure, not pain exactly, or not only pain, but a mechanical wrongness, the way a door feels when the hinge is damaged. I had packed what I could reach of my medical kit around it one-handed and continued, because the alternative to continuing was not acceptable. My grandmother's voice. The body can do anything the mind refuses to stop. I was not going to stop. The brood were 30 meters out when I heard the first shuttle engine. I know Coalition shuttle engine signatures. I have spent 6 months working alongside Coalition forces, and you learn the sound of the things that keep you alive. That was a Vethari heavy atmospheric craft, descending from the northeast, which was the direction of the Queen's bunker. Not my shuttle, the Queen's shuttle. She was still in the bunker, still waiting for pickup, still below me. I had not bought enough time yet, so I kept going. 30 meters is inside the range where the sidearm becomes genuinely useful against brood carapace, because at 30 meters the angle of the shot can reach the gap between the first and second thoracic plate if you put it in precisely the right place. It is a very specific place. I had been told, in a Coalition weapons briefing 3 months earlier, that only a handful of Coalition species had the visual acuity to place a shot that precisely at that range under field conditions. I had not said anything during that briefing, because I had learned that it was often more useful to listen in briefings than to correct them. I placed each shot precisely. The sidearm went empty. I found a magazine that had spilled from the belt of a brood unit I had dropped earlier, a Coalition pattern magazine, which meant it was from a Coalition soldier, which I did not let myself think about too much because thinking about it would have cost me something I could not afford to spend. I reloaded. And then the shuttle sound changed. I heard it descend, heard it reach the bunker approach, heard the change in engine note that meant it had touched down. I knew that sound. That was the sound of the door opening. She was boarding. She was getting out. I looked north, at the brood mass that was still flowing over the ridge on both sides of me, and I understood for the first time in 11 minutes that the math had changed. Not eliminated, still dangerous, still close, still requiring my full attention, but changed. The Queen was on the shuttle. The shuttle was lifting. The reason I was on this ridge was in the process of being resolved. I kept firing, because there were still brood within range, and stopping made no sense, but something in the back of my mind, the part that had been running the background calculations the whole time, the part that kept track of the numbers so the front of my mind could focus on the work, shifted, like a lock opening. Shame. It is a strange thing to notice, in the middle of a firefight, that you are still alive. I had not spent much time thinking about whether I would be alive at the end of this. That is not because I was not aware of the possibility of the opposite. I was fully aware. I had run those numbers the same way I ran all the numbers, and the numbers had not been encouraging. But you cannot hold a position and simultaneously devote cognitive space to the question of whether you will survive holding it, because the question itself is paralyzing, and the position needs to be held. You find out what the numbers actually were at the end, not at the beginning. The numbers, it turned out, allowed for me to still be here. I was still processing that when the command shuttle came over the ridge. I had not expected the command shuttle. I had expected my rescue, if rescue came, to be a distant extraction at a designated zone well away from the brood. I had not expected Commander Kael'rath to bring his command shuttle, with its considerably more conspicuous profile and considerably more exposed approach path, directly to the ridge where the brood were densest. The pilot was good, I will say that. He brought it in low and fast between two brood formations that had not yet identified the vehicle as a threat, and he put it down in a space that I would not have bet on fitting it. Then the commander himself came around the nose. I had worked with Kael'rath for 6 months. He was a professional in the most complete sense of the word. Thorough, controlled, precise. The kind of officer whose decisions you trust not because he is warm but because he is always right. He had said no to my requests to accompany forward scouting units with the kind of courteous finality that does not invite reapplication. I respected him. He came around the nose of the shuttle and stopped in front of me, and he looked at me with an expression I had not seen on a Vethari face before. They have mobile facial features, more mobile than most species credit them for, and I had learned to read the basic registrations. This expression was not in my basic vocabulary. He lowered his head to me. A slow, deep incline. Not a bow in the human sense, but clearly something formal, and clearly something significant. I was tired enough that my first thought was a practical one. I asked if it was a bow. An approximation, he said. I let out a breath that I had apparently been holding for a while. My right hand lowered the sidearm because there was no immediate target, and the weight had become significant. I looked at the plane to the north and watched the brood mass shift, the way they always shift when a larger signal presents. The Queen's shuttle was airborne, and airborne movement draws the collective the way scent draws simpler things. The pressure on the ridge was already easing. The Queen? I asked. Aboard the extraction shuttle. Lifting now. Good. That was the word that came. Just good. It fit. He helped me to the shuttle, which I allowed, because my left arm had decided it was done participating in the day's activities, and the pride that might have made me refuse the help was less interesting to me at that moment than sitting down. I sat in the crew compartment and leaned back and closed my eyes. The hum of the shuttle's engines was the most comfortable sound I had ever heard, a sound that meant upward, a sound that meant away, a sound that meant the part where you are required to be a fixed point in the universe is finished, and you can be a person again. I let the darkness behind my eyes be soft. I thought of my grandmother's kitchen. Not the words she said, just the kitchen itself, the yellow walls, the particular slant of morning light through the east window, the smell of coffee and something sweet, and the way the air in that room had always felt like a place the world could not reach. I let myself rest there for a moment. The shuttle cleared the atmosphere. I fell asleep. I do not know how long I slept. Long enough that when I woke, the planet below was a disk rather than a surface, and the stars outside the viewport were the stars of open space rather than atmosphere. The medical team had been busy while I slept. My left arm was in a rigid temporary brace. My shoulder had been cleaned and dressed, the accumulated minor damages of the past hours attended to with the quiet efficiency of people who are very good at what they do. Commander Kael'rath was sitting across from me. He was watching me with the same expression he had worn on the ridge. I still did not have a name for it. The Queen? I asked again, from habit. Safe, he said. En route to the Conclave fleet. Her guard is intact. The extraction was clean. I nodded. You should sleep more, he said. I should, I agreed. What were the final numbers? Brood ground force? He was quiet for a moment. Not reluctant. Considering. Approximately 14,000 in the forward advance group that reached Yeeson Prime surface. Perhaps 3,000 directly engaged with your position at peak contact. 3,000. I considered that. How many did I reduce? Our sensors tracked confirmed stops at your position. He paused. 211. 211 out of 3,000. Not a victory. Not even close to a victory by any conventional measure. But the conventional measure was not the one that had mattered today. The gap was 3 minutes, I said. That was all I needed. Yes, he said. That was all you needed. He said it in a way that made me think he had been sitting here calculating and recalculating for the duration of my sleep, running the numbers and arriving at the same place every time. That look on his face, I still did not have a word for it. It was not admiration exactly, though that was part of it. It was something more like the expression of a person who has had a significant belief revised and is still in the process of understanding what that means for everything built on top of the belief. "Commander," I said, "you came back to the ridge." "Yes." "You brought your command shuttle into a brood contact zone." "Yes." That was not the rational choice. He was quiet for a long moment. "No," he said finally. "It was not. I have been thinking about that." He did not elaborate. I did not press. Some decisions explain themselves better if you give them time. I looked out the viewport at the stars and thought about my grandmother, and the yellow kitchen, and the particular truth that some things only become visible when you stop running numbers and start paying attention to what is actually there. The numbers had said 7 minutes was an unbridgeable gap. The numbers had been working with incomplete information. The numbers had not known about me. I did not say any of this to the commander. He was a smart being, and he was clearly already working through his own version of it. I just looked at the stars and felt the weight of the brace on my arm, and the deep, particular tiredness that comes not from effort alone, but from the specific expenditure of the thing that you only find when everything else is gone. I was very tired. But I was here. The universe is full of gaps between what the numbers say and what is actually possible. You find them by going to the ridge. You find them by refusing to let the math have the last word. You find them by breathing slowly and placing the shot, and doing the next thing, and then the next thing, and then the next thing, until there is no next thing required. 3 minutes. That was the gap. I had found it. I looked at the commander and I said, "I'm going to need a very good debrief snack." He made a sound I had not heard him make before. Something that, on a human face, would have been the beginning of a smile. "I will arrange it," he said. I closed my eyes again. The shuttle carried me home. I have lived 412 years. This is not a fact I mention to make an impression. It is relevant context for what I am about to describe, because the weight of 412 years of experience is precisely what made the next 14 minutes the most instructive of my life. When you have lived 4 centuries, you develop a kind of internal map of what the world contains. You stop being surprised by most things because you have encountered most things, or close enough to most things that the variations do not significantly revise the map. You have seen species rise. You have watched treaties fail and be replaced by other treaties. You have outlasted people who seemed essential and watched the world continue without them. The map becomes very detailed and very steady, and you trust it the way you trust an old road, not because it is perfect, but because it has gotten you this far. The bunker beneath the Yisan Prime diplomatic complex had been built to specifications I had personally reviewed before agreeing to the visit. 10 meters of reinforced composite overhead, filtered air cycling, emergency communication arrays independent of the surface relay system, a small but exceptionally capable personal guard under the command of Keth Voran, who had been with me for 31 years and had the particular quality of absolute reliability that comes only from that length of tested service. I was not afraid of the bunker. What I was afraid of, as the minutes passed and the sound above us changed, was the silence between sounds. There is a specific kind of listening that happens when you are underground and something important is happening above you. It is not passive. You lean into it. You strain against it. You are trying to extract information from vibration and muffled percussion and the quality of the air itself, trying to build a picture from materials that are not designed to carry one. Every impact of the brood advance registered as a shift in the floor beneath us. Low, rolling tremors that the composite absorbed but did not fully eliminate. Keth Voran stood near the communication console and monitored the surface feeds without speaking, which told me the surface feeds did not contain anything he felt he should say aloud. I had known Keth Voran for 31 years. I could read his silence the way I could read a clear report. "Tell me," I said. He turned from the console. His expression was controlled in the way that expressions are controlled when the person wearing them is choosing what to show rather than showing what they feel. "The coalition ground forces have completed their withdrawal, Your Grace." I waited. "All units are clear of the forward line." "All units," I said. "And the surface?" The surface is brood occupied at the forward positions. The ridge. He paused, and in the pause, I heard the thing he was deciding how to tell me. The ridge is under single-point defense. Explain single point. He looked at me steadily. 1 soldier, Your Grace. The extraction shuttle is 12 minutes out. The brood advance will reach the ridge in under 4 minutes. 1 coalition soldier has positioned on the ridge to contest the approach. I sat with that for a moment. Species? I asked. Human, Your Grace. Human. I knew what that meant. I had the briefings the way every head of state has briefings on new coalition members, population figures, geopolitical structure, cultural notes, military capability assessments. The Human Military Capability Assessment was labeled Developing by Coalition Standards, which was a diplomatic way of saying that they were still learning what coalition-scale warfare required. Their individual soldiers were noted as capable and highly motivated. Their doctrine was described as adaptive. Their combat record within coalition operations was described as promising. 1 human soldier, 12 minutes from rescue, 4 minutes from contact. What is the soldier's name? I asked. Kethvoran checked the console. Vasquez. Sergeant First Class Dara Vasquez, United Earth Marine Corps. I repeated the name softly. It was not a Vethari sound, not a Drenhari sound, not anything in the broad phonetic family of coalition languages that I had spent 4 centuries learning. It was a collection of sounds from a very young species on a planet I had never visited, a name given by people I would never meet, carried by a person who was, at that moment, climbing a ridge on the other side of a layer of composite and 10 meters of engineered ground, climbing toward the brood. The sound above us changed. It began as a distant percussion, evenly spaced, precise, the sound of something operating at its intended purpose with the unhurried rhythm of skill rather than panic. A weapon, a rifle. My recognition of such things informed me, though I had not been in proximity to active ground combat in over 2 centuries. The rhythm of it was distinctive, not automatic, not spray and pray in the way that frightened beings fire. Each shot was its own event, each one considered, each one placed. Kethvoran was watching the surface telemetry. Brood forward elements taking fire, he said quietly. Column compressing. She is slowing them, I said. Yes, Your Grace. He did not add anything to that. He did not need to. We were both hearing the same rhythm and drawing the same conclusion and understanding the same thing about what that rhythm meant. It meant 1 person, alone, on a ridge above us, choosing a target and choosing the next target and choosing the one after that, and doing it with the kind of patient precision that is the opposite of desperation. I stood from the chair where my security detail had installed me and walked to the center of the room. I did not sit again for the next 11 minutes. The guards in the room watched me move but said nothing. They are trained to allow the Queen freedom of movement within a secured space. What they are not trained for, what nobody in this room was trained for, was the particular quality of waiting that those 11 minutes required. We could hear her. That is the thing I want to be clear about, because I think it is important. We were 10 meters underground in a reinforced bunker, and we could hear the rhythm of her fire, not clearly, not with the precision that the surface sensors would have provided, but through the composite and the earth and the distance, a faint, steady pulse, like a signal from very far away, like something tapping out a message in a language that does not use words. I have attended conclave sessions where species debated the military contributions of newer members for hours, with charts and comparative assessments and historical analyses. I have heard the phrase, developing military capability, used so many times that it has become a kind of wallpaper, present everywhere and noticed nowhere. I have heard species that have been part of the coalition for centuries speak of the younger members with the affectionate condescension of the experienced toward the novice. I thought about all of it in those 11 minutes, about all the words we have for what we expect from others, and how rarely we revise those words until something forces us to. The rhythm above us did not stop. Extraction shuttle is 9 minutes out, Kethvoran said. 9 minutes. She had already held for 3. Brood flanking movement on the west approach, he added. Forward elements redirecting. She has anticipated the movement. Targeting has shifted to the flank. I looked at him. She anticipated it. Before our sensors confirmed the movement. His voice was carefully neutral. which was how Keth Voren expressed things that surprised him. Yes, Your Grace. I thought about that. About what it means to anticipate a movement that your sensors have not yet confirmed. About the kind of experience and attention that produces that kind of perception. About how a being develops that, not in a training hall but in the field, in the difficult places, in the gaps where theory ends and reality begins. The floor trembled, a larger impact, closer than before. The rhythm above us absorbed it and continued. She took a hit, Keth Voren said, reading the telemetry. Debris impact. Left shoulder. She has maintained position. Maintained position. She had been struck and she had maintained position, and the rhythm continued, and I was standing in the center of a reinforced bunker, with 40 years of my own guard service around me, and a planet's worth of coalition military resources above me that had entirely evacuated, and the only thing standing between me and the brood was one soldier named Dara Vasquez, who was maintaining her position. I found that I wanted to know more about her. It is a strange impulse for a moment like this, wanting biographical information in the middle of an active defense, but I think it was the mind's attempt to make a person out of a telemetry reading. We receive sensor data and we draw conclusions, but a sensor reading is not a person. I wanted the person. Her service record, I said. Keth Voren raised an eyebrow fractionally, but pulled the file. 11 years in the United Earth Marine Corps. Multiple deployments. Service commendations for, he scrolled, conduct under fire on 3 separate occasions. Her commanding officer's assessment describes her as, he hesitated for a moment, translating from the human language in his head, someone who always runs toward the sound rather than away from it. Runs toward the sound, I repeated. It is a human idiom, apparently. The sound refers to the sound of combat. I stood with that for a moment. 412 years of language study, and I had not previously encountered that particular construction. It is such a simple image, the sound of danger, and the direction you choose in relation to it, toward or away. Most beings, given the choice, select away. The mathematics of survival support the selection of away. Evolution, across most species, rewards the selection of away. She ran toward the sound, not recklessly, not without thought, but consistently, as a pattern of behavior, as a characteristic noted in her record before this ridge, before this moment, before this particular sound. This was not a single decision made under extreme circumstances. This was a person being who they had always been, in extreme circumstances. The rhythm above us had been going for 7 minutes. Shuttle is 5 minutes out, Keth Voren said. Beginning atmospheric entry. 5 minutes. She had bought us 7. The gap from the beginning, 7 minutes that the math had said could not be closed, was now 2 minutes. 2 minutes that the shuttle could cover in descent. 2 minutes that the Purin's guard could manage at the bunker door if necessary. 2 minutes that were survivable. She had found 7 minutes where I had been told there were none. Her telemetry, I said. What does it show? Keth Voren studied the console. Left arm injury is more significant than initial reading suggested. Structural damage consistent with impact trauma. But she has applied field dressing. He paused. She transitioned to sidearm approximately 2 minutes ago. The rifle? Empty, it appears. She was on a sidearm, against thousands. 8 minutes into what the math had said was a position that could not be held for 40 seconds. Her heart rate? I asked. I do not know why I asked. Perhaps because it was the most human piece of information available, the most direct signal from her body to ours, the telemetry reading that felt least like data and most like a voice. Keth Voren looked at the reading. He looked at it for long enough that I knew the answer was going to be something worth looking at twice. 58 beats per minute, Your Grace. I had studied human physiology as part of the standard briefings. I knew what a human heart rate under extreme physical and psychological stress was expected to be. I knew that 58 was not only below that expectation, but below the standard human resting rate. She was calmer than rest. In the middle of that ridge, with a broken arm and an empty rifle, and thousands of brood, and the absolute certain knowledge of what would happen if she stopped, she was calmer than rest. I thought about the 42 warships that had retreated. I thought about the 3 ground divisions that had withdrawn. I thought about the coalition forces, experienced, equipped, trained, rational, who had looked at the same situation and made the same calculation and arrived at the same conclusion. that this position could not be held, and remaining would accomplish nothing. They were not wrong. The calculation was correct. The conclusion followed from the premises. She had simply declined to accept the conclusion. The floor trembled again. Stronger this time. The second anti-armor charge detonated. I recognized the quality of the blast, closer and sharper than the first. Keth Voren steadied himself against the console. "Shuttle is 3 minutes out," he said, beginning final approach. 3 minutes. I could hear the rhythm above us, still going, still steady, though it had changed. Faster now. The rhythm of a shorter range weapon, which meant the range had closed. Which meant they were close. I walked to the bunker door and stood in front of it. My guards moved immediately to positions on either side, weapons ready, which was the correct response to the Queen standing at the only exit. I did not move back. "Your Grace," Keth Voren said from behind me. "I hear the shuttle," I said. I did. Barely. Through the composite and the earth. But I could hear the engine note changing as it descended. The particular drop in frequency that means a vessel is slowing for ground contact. Above us, the rhythm of Vasquez's fire continued. "Shuttle has touched down at the surface entrance," Keth Voren confirmed. "Docking seal engaged. Ready for boarding, Your Grace." The door opened. The entrance corridor was 8 meters of reinforced passage that connected the bunker directly to the shuttle docking collar. Keth Voren's guard formed around me immediately, which is their training and their purpose, and in this moment was absolutely necessary. We moved quickly. We moved as quickly as dignity and the constraints of the tunnel permitted, which was faster than most beings would expect a 412-year-old sovereign to move. I was through the docking collar and aboard the shuttle in under 40 seconds. The shuttle door sealed behind me. The engine note changed again, the note of lifting rather than landing. I sat in the command seat and felt the shuttle rise, and I thought about what was still on that ridge. The telemetry feeds on the shuttle's systems showed her position. Still there, still active, still the small orange dot on the overlay that had been the most important thing in the universe for the past 11 minutes. "Take us up," I told the pilot, "and get me a communication line to Field Commander Kaelrath." The pilot complied. When the connection opened, I said, "Commander, the soldier on the ridge. Status." A pause, then Kaelrath's voice, with something in it that I had not heard in 6 years of working with the Vethari's best field commander. "Alive, Your Grace. I am going to retrieve her." "Good," I said. And then, because it was the truth, and the truth deserved to be said in real time rather than in retrospect, "Her name is Dara Vasquez. Remember it. We are going to need to know it for a very long time." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes, Your Grace," he said. I leaned back in the command seat and let the shuttle carry me upward through the atmosphere of Yisan Prime, and I listened to the engine note and the fading sounds of the surface and the gradual silence that comes with altitude, and I thought about a rhythm I had heard through 10 meters of composite and the earth of a planet. Steady, precise, refusing to stop. I have lived 412 years. In that time, I have met courage in many forms. I have seen beings sacrifice themselves for causes, and for people, and for principles that mattered deeply to them. I have honored that sacrifice, and I have tried to be worthy of it, and I have not always succeeded. I had never heard courage before, not like that, not reduced to its plainest form, the sound of someone choosing, again and again, in the space between each breath, to continue. She had given me 14 minutes of her life to keep mine. I intended to make sure the next 400 years of mine were worth the gift. The last magazine seeded with a click that I felt more than heard, because my ears had been through a significant amount by that point and were operating at reduced capacity. The world had narrowed to a strip of ridge, a slope, and the things coming up it. 211 confirmed stops. That was the number they gave me later. In the moment, I was not counting. Counting is for after. During, you count only what matters immediately. How many rounds in the current magazine, how far the nearest threat is, whether the approach angle has changed in the last 10 seconds. Everything else is noise. The noise was considerable. I want to describe what it was like up there, because I think it is important, and because most accounts of situations like this one focus on the outcome and compress the middle. The outcome was that the Queen escaped, and I survived. Both of those facts are true, and both of them matter. But the middle is where the real story is, and the middle is what I lived through 1 second at a time, in a way that the outcome cannot convey. The Karath Ridge, at its highest point, is perhaps 3 meters wide. I had the northeast face, which was the best ground, enough broken rock to provide partial cover from the forward approach, enough angle to see the northern slope without fully exposing my position. Behind me, the slope dropped away toward the bunker complex. Between me and the brood, first 800 meters of open ground, then the 40-meter rise of the northern slope, then me. For the first 3 minutes, the geometry favored me completely. Distance is your friend in a rifle engagement. At 800 meters, I had time between shots to assess, to adjust, to pick the next target before the previous one had fully registered. The brood scouts moved in irregular patterns, not random, because nothing the brood does is random, but variable enough that each one required its own calculation. I made each calculation. I placed each shot. 3 minutes in, the geometry changed because the main column hit the slope. On a slope, distance compresses. A target that was 800 meters away becomes 600, becomes 400, because the slope is bringing them up toward you at an angle that reduces horizontal distance faster than the rangefinder accounts for. You have to adjust for that, which is not complicated but requires attention. And at the same time, the column is wider now because it has spread to avoid the central approach where I had been most effective, which means you are tracking targets across a wider arc. Wider arc, decreasing range, increasing target density. This is the part that I think sounds manageable in description and is not manageable in experience. Not because any individual element is beyond capability, but because all of them are happening at the same time, continuously, without pause, and each second that passes the elements are slightly more extreme than they were the second before. You cannot stop and recalibrate. You cannot take a breath and reassess. The situation does not pause while you think about it. So you do not pause. You are the thing that keeps moving, while everything else accelerates. My shoulder took a fragment around the 4-minute mark. I knew it had happened because the pain arrived, sharp and specific, in the way that impacts create very specific pain that is distinct from the dull, distributed ache of sustained physical effort. I completed the shot I was in the middle of before I thought about the shoulder at all. Then I ran a quick internal diagnostic, still moving, still functional, still able to work the action with both hands, pain elevated but not incapacitating. I packed it with gauze from my kit by feel, not looking, and continued. The field dressing is not a medical procedure. It is a delaying action. What it does is reduce blood loss and protect the wound from further contamination, and what it does not do is address the underlying damage or reduce the pain. It is, in the most literal sense, a way of telling your body, we will deal with you properly later. Not now, later. The body accepts this remarkably well if you have trained it to accept it. The training is not pleasant. At the 6-minute mark, the left flank reached the critical point, the area where the terrain offered cover that the brood could use to approach within effective range without being fully exposed to my firing position. I had known this was coming. There is only so much a single rifle can do against terrain. The terrain has limits. I had worked with its limits and made my position as effective as possible within them, but the limits existed, and the left flank found them. I deployed the first anti-armor charge. The decision point for an anti-armor charge is simple in theory and complicated in practice. In theory, when the threat concentration reaches a point where the blast radius will achieve maximum effect. In practice, you are in the middle of managing 3 other simultaneous threats. The approaching flank is not pausing to be convenient, and the charge deployment requires you to hold still and be very precise about placement and timing, during which time you are not shooting at the other 2 threats. I held still. I was precise. I deployed the charge. The explosion was closer than I would have preferred. The pressure wave hit me across the left side and threw me flat against the rock in a way that would have been concerning in a more leisurely situation. I came back up immediately because the alternative was worse. The world was ringing with a solid high pitch. The left flank was disrupted, not eliminated, but disrupted, and I had approximately 40 seconds before it reorganized. I used the 40 seconds to reposition. The new position was 20 meters east, slightly lower on the ridge but with better angle on the right approach, which had been advancing while I managed the left. Moving positions under fire is something you train for until the training becomes muscle memory. because thinking about it consciously costs time. My body moved. My mind was already at the new position, assessing the angle, ranging the targets. The rifle went dry at the 11th magazine. There is a moment when the rifle runs empty that is purely mechanical. The bolt locks open, the trigger does nothing, and your hands are already moving before your mind has articulated the situation. Empty. Transition. The sidearm was in my right hand before the thought completed itself. My left hand had already let the rifle fall to the sling position. A sidearm at combat range is a different conversation than a rifle at extended range. The rifle is architecture. You build the engagement from a distance. You control the geometry. You choose the terms. The sidearm is immediate. It is personal. It requires you to be close to the thing you are engaging with, which means the thing you are engaging with is also close to you, and close proximity to several thousand brood is not a comfortable arrangement. But it was what I had, and what you have is what you use. I found one of the dropped magazines from a brood casualty that had been carrying coalition pattern equipment. The brood sometimes carry salvaged coalition gear. They do not use it themselves, but it gets transported along with everything else in the advance. The magazine was intact and fully loaded. I reloaded. The right flank was now inside 50 meters. At 50 meters, the sidearm's effective range becomes much more useful relative to brood carapace vulnerability. The gap between the first and second thoracic plates is approximately 3 centimeters wide at the angle you can achieve at 50 meters. At 200 meters, it is not a realistic shot. At 50, it is demanding but achievable if your fundamentals are sound. My fundamentals were sound. The second anti-armor charge went at 30 meters, on the right side, because the right side had made the most significant progress, and the 30-meter range meant the blast radius would be maximally effective. The charge went down. I was behind the rock. The blast came. I have described the previous blast as closer than I would have preferred. This one was closer than that. The backwash hit me across the right side with enough force to knock me horizontal. My ears went completely silent for a moment. Not just reduced, but genuinely silent, as though someone had turned off the universe's audio. I experienced a strange, brief suspension in which I was aware of falling, and was simultaneously aware of the dirt hitting my face, and was simultaneously computing the tactical consequence of being horizontal, with the right flank 30 meters away. The consequence required me to be vertical again immediately. I came up. My left arm informed me, at that exact moment, that it was no longer a reliable structure. The pain was sharp in a specific way that is different from impact pain. It had the quality of something under stress, that the stress has exceeded, something bent past its tolerance. I did not need to look at it to know what had happened. The arm still moved, barely, but the movement was not trusted. I brought it across my chest, and held it there, and told it, later, later, right hand, sidearm, target. I was aware that the shuttle was close, not from the radio. I had my earpiece in, but the last clear communication had been 11 minutes ago, when Commander Kaelrath had tried to order me back, and I had declined in the politest possible terms. I was aware because of the sound. The engine note of a descending Vethari heavy atmospheric craft is distinctive enough to identify through damaged hearing at close range, and what I was hearing through the ringing in my ears was that note. She was boarding. I knew it the way you know things when you have been paying extremely close attention for a sustained period, not from data, not from communication, but from the accumulation of signals that the conscious mind does not process individually. The shuttle had descended. The pitch changed. That change meant contact with the surface. Contact meant door open. Door open meant boarding. She was getting out. The thing I had come here to create, time, had been created. The Queen was using it. I kept shooting because there were brood within 25 meters, and stopping was not a reasonable option. But something in the background calculation shifted. The goal had been achieved. Everything from here was, I tried to find the right word and settled on, extra. Everything from here was extra time, bonus existence, the part of the problem that had been solved but whose solving I was still in the middle of, physically, with a broken arm and a sidearm, and 25 meters of brood. I am not going to tell you that I was not afraid. I was afraid. I had been afraid the whole time. I want to be clear about that because I think there is a mythology around soldiers who do things like this that removes the fear from the story, and the fear is important. The fear is the thing the choice is made against. Without fear, there is no courage. There is only preference. I was afraid, and I kept going, and those two things existed at the same time without contradiction. My grandmother did not say, "The body can do anything the mind refuses to stop, only if you are not afraid." She said it without qualifications because she understood that qualifications were not the point. The shuttle engine note changed again. Lifting. She was up. I exhaled. Something about that exhale was different from all the previous exhales. Not relief, exactly. The situation was not resolved. There were still brood 20 meters away, and my arm was broken, and my ears were mostly not working, and I was operating on the sidearm's last magazine. But something released. A grip that I had not consciously been maintaining. The particular internal tension of being the only thing between two facts. She was up. The mission was complete. Whatever happened to me now was not the mission anymore. It was just what happened. The brood were 15 meters away. I had 8 rounds left. I placed them 8 times. The sidearm locked open. I reached for the knife, which is, I am aware, a solution to a problem that the knife cannot fully solve. But the knife was the next thing I had, and the next thing is what you use. My right hand found the handle. The blade opened. I held it ready. And then, from overhead, a sound that was not the shuttle's departing engine note, and was not the brood mass, and was not my own breathing. A different engine. Heavier. Closer. Descending rather than ascending. A second shuttle. It came over the ridge low and fast, between 2 brood formations, and it landed in a space that barely existed for it. The pilot was extraordinary. I watched the entry and the landing with the part of my mind that was still assessing the technical quality of everything happening around me, which is apparently not a part of the mind that turns off even in the conditions I was currently experiencing. Someone came around the nose. Commander Kaelrath. He came around the nose of his command shuttle and stood in front of me, and he looked at me the way no one had ever looked at me in 11 years of military service. I still do not have a precise word for that look. I know what it was not. It was not the admiring look that turns people into monuments, not the pitying look that turns difficulty into tragedy. It was something that existed between those things, something that took me as I actually was, in the actual condition I was in the actual place I was standing. He bowed his head. The gesture was slow and formal. I knew enough about Vethari culture to know that head inclination carried significant meaning, though the specific register of this one was outside my reference set. "Is that a bow?" I asked. "An approximation," he said. I let out a breath. My right hand lowered the knife because there was no immediate target within range, and maintaining the combat grip was costing energy I did not have to spend unnecessarily. I looked north, at the brood mass that was already beginning to shift, the collective directive updating toward the larger, moving signal of the Queen's ascending shuttle, pulling the advance the way a current pulls loose things. The pressure on my position eased. Not completely. There were still brood within 20 meters on both sides, but the mass movement had changed direction. The thing they had been coming for was no longer here. Only I was here. "The Queen?" I said. "Aboard the extraction shuttle. Lifting now." "Good." He put his hand on my right arm. Not gripping, not pulling. Just there, steady. The way you put a hand on something to confirm it is real. He guided me toward the shuttle ramp, and I allowed it, because my left arm had made a definitive decision to be unhelpful, and the terrain between me and the ramp was uneven, and I was not going to be foolish about it. The ramp accepted my weight. The shuttle interior was warm. I sat down against the hull and leaned back and felt the warmth of the ambient temperature, which I had not noticed being cold until I noticed being warm. I closed my eyes. The medical team's hands arrived first, not urgently, not with the frantic quality of an emergency, but with the calm competence of people who are very good at what they do, and are doing it. They moved around the broken arm. They worked on the shoulder. They spoke to each other in Vethari too quickly for me to follow, but the tone was not alarmed. The engine hum deepened. We were lifting. I kept my eyes closed, and let the vertical motion carry me, and thought about my grandmother's kitchen, and the yellow walls, and the way the morning light came in, at exactly the angle that made even ordinary things look significant. The coffee, the bread, the sound of the city waking up outside, the particular piece of a place where you are completely safe and completely known. I was very tired. The tired that comes from the bottom of the reserves, from the place that is past the second wind and past the third, from the place where the body has negotiated with itself and produced something it cannot explain, and is now requesting payment in full. I owed the tired a significant debt. I could pay it now. The shuttle carried me upward. The planet fell away below. The stars outside the viewport were the stars of open space, not atmosphere, not distance through air, but actual space, the real stars, the ones that are always there when you clear the thin line between what you are standing on and everything else. I was not afraid of those stars. I had never been afraid of them. I fell asleep looking at them, and my last coherent thought was something my grandmother had never actually said, but that I thought she might have approved of. The gap was 3 minutes, and I found it, and that is enough. That is enough. She slept for 19 hours. I know the exact duration, because I checked the medical team's log 3 times. Not because I doubted it, but because the number seemed important, in a way I could not entirely explain. 19 hours. The length of time a human body requires to process what it had been asked to process, to conduct the internal accounting that the fight had been too urgent to allow, to settle all the debts that had been deferred through 2 hours of high-stress operation, and 11 minutes of something that did not have a medical category. The medical team's report was thorough. Structural fracture in the left radius and ulna, multiple soft tissue impacts across the left shoulder and upper torso, minor laceration across the left jaw, already healing at the rate human biology handles surface wounds, which is slower than most coalition species but more complete. Elevated inflammatory markers consistent with sustained physical exertion. Minor hearing damage in both ears from repeated blast exposure, expected to resolve fully within 4 to 6 standard days. The report did not include a category for what I had watched her do on that ridge. There is no medical term for the maintenance of a 58 beat per minute heart rate under the conditions she had experienced. It is not a treatment. It is not a technique. It is something that exists inside a person and expresses itself when the conditions require it, and medicine can describe the effects but not the source. She woke in the Fleet Medical Bay aboard the cruiser Steadfast Patience, with the particular sudden alertness of someone who has spent years training themselves to assess their environment before they are fully conscious. I had been informed by the attending physician that she was awake and had chosen to visit, which was not a thing I would normally do. I have a fleet to manage and a war to continue to manage, and approximately 17 ongoing crises that required my attention in the 23 hours since Eason Prime. I visited anyway. She was sitting up in the medical bed with her left arm in a full regenerative cast, and her dark eyes doing the thing they always did, moving, measuring, cataloging. She had been in this bay for 19 hours, and she already knew the room. "Commander," she said. "Sergeant," I said. I sat in the chair next to the bed, which required me to fold my longer Vethari frame into a space designed for human proportions. She watched me manage this with an expression that was not quite amusement, but contained the raw material for it. "How do you feel?" I asked. "Like someone broke my arm," she said. "The medical team has confirmed that assessment." The corner of her mouth moved. "What's the status?" She meant the battle. She meant the Queen, the fleet, the brood, the current position of every variable that mattered to the operation she had last had full information on 11 minutes before her extraction. I answered all of it. The Queen was aboard the Conclave flagship, safe, already in contact with the coalition political apparatus, to manage the immediate diplomatic consequences of the Eason Prime incursion. The fleet had regrouped at the outer defensive line and was holding position while the brood advance extended, and then, as brood advances do when they have consumed what is available, began to lose cohesion. The ground forces lost at Eason Prime were significant, but not catastrophic. We had saved what we came to save. She listened to all of it with the same focused attention she brought to everything, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The 3rd Battalion?" she asked. "Lost approximately 30% of their strength in the initial engagement. 14 dead, 23 wounded." She absorbed this in the way experienced soldiers absorb casualty numbers. Not coldly, but with a specific kind of internal management that keeps the weight of the information from interfering with the necessity of continuing to think clearly. I had seen it in my own soldiers. I recognized it across species. The management does not mean the feeling is absent. It means the feeling is being held in a place where it will be properly attended to later. 14, she said quietly. Yes. She did not say anything else about it. She did not need to. The Brood's null-tied weapon, I said. Our technical teams want your observations. You were on the ground when it discharged. Your perspective may add to the sensor data. I'll talk to them whenever they're ready. Tomorrow, if you feel able. Today, if they have time. I looked at her. She met my eyes without any particular expression. Not challenging, not performing. Simply present. Simply ready. Today, then, I said. We sat quietly for a moment. Outside the medical bay viewport, the stars of open space moved slowly as the ship maintained its holding position. Below us, somewhere behind the planet's limb, Ysen Prime continued existing without us on it. The Brood advance would peak and then withdraw, as they always withdrew when the available material was consumed. The planet would be recoverable. These things would take time, but they would happen. There is something I want to ask you, I said. She waited. When you made the decision to hold the ridge, when you turned north while everyone else was moving south, what were you thinking? She considered the question for longer than I expected. Not because she did not have an answer, I thought, but because she was deciding which answer was the true one, rather than the convenient one. I was thinking about the gap, she said finally. The 7 minutes. I'd done the math. Everyone had done the math. 7 minutes between when the Brood would cross the ridge and when the shuttle could reach the bunker. She looked at the viewport. But math starts with assumptions. One of the assumptions in that math was that the gap was fixed, that it was a property of the situation rather than something that could be addressed. You believed it could be addressed. I believed it could be reduced, she said. Not fixed, not made zero, just smaller. And smaller was enough. You could not have known you would survive long enough to make the reduction meaningful. No, she agreed. I couldn't. And yet you went. She looked at me. Someone had to. 3 words. The same 3 words, in a slightly different arrangement, that had been the foundation of every calculation she had made on that ridge. Someone had to. Not me specifically, not because of any particular quality she claimed for herself, not as a statement of exceptional capability or exceptional willingness. Simply, the thing needed doing, and she was the one who was there, and so she did it. I thought about the Vethari philosophy of strategic sacrifice, which I had studied for 40 years, and considered myself competent to discuss in academic terms. The philosophy is elaborate and the arguments are refined, and the literature on the subject fills many volumes, and the conclusion, after all the pages, is that sacrifice is meaningful when the thing preserved by the sacrifice is more valuable than the thing sacrificed. She had not used that framework. She had used. Someone had to. I was not sure which framework was deeper. The Queen wants to meet you, I said. She blinked. It was the first thing I had said that produced an expression change beyond what her controlled baseline allowed. The Queen. Queen Sareth Voss. She asked for a meeting as soon as you were medically cleared. The medical team has cleared you for light activity. I'm in a hospital bed. A meeting can be conducted from a hospital bed. She looked at the cast on her arm, then at me. Does she know I told you she owed me a snack? She does. She found it. I am again translating loosely. Charming. The corner of her mouth moved again, more fully this time. Something that was beginning to resemble a smile. Tell her I'll see her, she said. The meeting happened 3 hours later, conducted via secure communication link between the medical bay and the Conclave flagship. Queen Sareth Voss was in her stateroom, which was visible through the communication display as a space of quiet, considered elegance. Old wood panels, a single window showing stars, nothing that was there for any reason, except that it served a purpose, or was genuinely beautiful. She was older than any being I had seen, and she looked it in the way that 4 centuries of deliberate living express themselves. Not in frailty, but in the quality of absolute stillness that comes from having nothing left to prove and knowing it. She looked at Dara Vasquez in the medical bed with the regenerative cast and the healing scratch across her jaw, and her expression did something that I had not seen a Vethari sovereign's expression do in my entire career. It was gentle. I understand you have been asking about your debrief snack, the Queen said. Dara laughed. An actual laugh, quick and real. I may have said something like that. I have arranged for a full assortment of human foods to be prepared on the flagship when you are well enough to visit, the Queen said. It is the least significant thing I can offer you, but it seemed like the right place to begin. It's a good place to begin, Dara said. My guard officer told me your name, the Queen said, while I was in the bunker. I asked for it because I wanted to know whose work I was hearing. Whose work you were hearing? Through the composite, through the rock, through 10 meters of reinforced structure. The Queen paused. The rhythm of it. Do you understand what I mean? The pattern of it. I could hear that it was deliberate, that it was not panic, that it was someone doing a job. Dara was quiet for a moment.
I was doing a job,
She said. You were doing considerably more than that, the Queen said, but I appreciate that you see it that way. It is the perspective of someone who does not need to be told they were remarkable in order to know what they did. I knew what the numbers said, Dara said. I just thought the numbers were missing something. They were missing you. The silence that followed that sentence was the kind of silence that happens when something true is said simply, and both people in the conversation recognize it as true, and there is no need to build on it or qualify it, or approach it from another angle. The Queen said, I intend to present you with the Serath Commendation. It has not been awarded in 2 centuries. I do not believe it has ever been awarded to a member of a species that did not yet exist as a coalition member when it was last given. But I intend to award it to you, because the alternative is to not acknowledge what you did, and I am not willing to do that. Dara was quiet. I realize you may find the ceremony uncomfortable, the Queen said. I am told humans have complicated feelings about being singled out for recognition. Some of us do, Dara said. Nevertheless. Dara nodded. A single, small nod. All right, she said. Thank you. After the communication closed, I sat in the medical bay with Dara for a while longer. The day had been long by any standard, and the medical team had gently indicated that their patient would benefit from rest, and the medical team was right, but I found myself reluctant to leave. There is a quality that certain conversations have, where the absence of urgency is itself significant, where the fact that there is nothing pressing to resolve allows a different kind of exchange. Can I ask you something? She said. Yes. You came back for me. With the command shuttle. That was not the rational choice. I had said as much to her. Earlier. I had admitted it. No, I said again. Why? I thought about the question honestly. I had been thinking about it, in some part of my awareness, for the entire time since it happened. Because the rational choice had already been made, I said. 42 ships, 3 ground divisions. All of them made the rational choice. The rational choice was correct. It was also insufficient. You filled the gap that the rational choice left open. I paused. It seemed inconsistent to make the rational choice when it came to retrieving you. She looked at me for a long moment. That's the most logical explanation for an illogical decision I've ever heard. I have been thinking about that, I said. About the line between rational and what is beyond it. I have been thinking that perhaps the rational choice and the right choice are not always the same calculation. No, she said. They're not. Your species seems to understand that intuitively. She tilted her head slightly. Some of us. Not all of us. Nobody does everything right. No species does everything right, I agreed. But the ones who last tend to have people who know the difference between what the math says and what needs to be done. She looked at the viewport, at the stars. My grandmother used to say something, she said, about the body doing anything the mind refuses to stop. That is a remarkable philosophy. She was a remarkable person. A pause. She survived things I don't know all the details of. She never told me the full story. She just gave me the line, and let me figure out what it meant. And what does it mean? She was quiet for a long time. It means the limit is further out than you think, she said. Whatever point you've decided is the end. It's not. It's just a point you chose. The actual end is further. You don't know where it is until you go past every point you've chosen, and find out what's still there. What is still there? She slept again after that, more easily than the first time. The 19 hours of initial recovery had done its work, and the remaining tiredness was the gentler kind, the kind the body uses to finish the jobs it started. I sat for a while longer than was strictly necessary, and looked at the stars and thought about limits and where they actually are. When I left, I stopped in the corridor outside the medical bay and took out my personal communication device and made a note for the formal after-action report that I would file in 3 days. The note read, "Revise all assessments of human military capability. The current frameworks are structurally incomplete." Then I went back to work. There was still a war to manage, but something had shifted in how I understood the managing of it. The conclave chamber holds 81 delegates. I have addressed it 14 times in my career, at various points of crisis or consequence, delivering reports and recommendations to the assembled representatives of 40 species, whose combined political weight is enough to determine the shape of the next century. I know the acoustics of the room. I know the protocols and the seating arrangement, and the particular quality of attention that the chamber gives to a field commander reporting from active operations, which is the kind of attention that contains skepticism and hope in roughly equal measure. I had never been nervous addressing the chamber before. I was nervous this time, not because the material was difficult, or because I feared the political reception, or because I was uncertain of my conclusions. I was nervous because I was about to say something that was important, in the kind of way that cannot be unsaid, that revises understanding, in a direction that does not allow for retreat to the previous position. When you tell 81 delegates, representing 400 years of accumulated coalition military doctrine, that their fundamental assumptions about a member species require revision, you had better be right. I was right. But being right and being heard are not the same thing, and I wanted very badly to be heard. The chamber fell quiet when I took the podium. It falls quiet for all speakers. Protocol requires it. But the quality of the quiet varies. Some speakers receive the polite quiet of obligation. Some receive the attentive quiet of expected content. I received, that day, the particular quiet that comes when a room full of intelligent beings senses that they are about to hear something they were not expecting. I had sent them my written report 48 hours earlier. They had all read it. I knew from the diplomatic channels that it had produced significant discussion, the kind that happens when a document says something that contradicts existing frameworks. Several delegates had sent inquiries asking for clarification. Several others had sent inquiries that were more accurately described as polite challenges. The Asorath representative had sent a very long message that was clearly the product of several hours of careful composition, and that ultimately asked, in the most diplomatic possible terms, whether I had perhaps overstated my conclusions. I had not overstated my conclusions. I began the address the way I always begin, with the facts. The Yeeson Prime incursion, the null-tide weapon, the evacuation order, the gap that opened between the Queen's position and safety. I presented the sensor data. I presented the tactical timeline. I presented the numbers, the brood force size, the Queen's shuttle time, the 7-minute gap, the 11 minutes and 23 seconds that one soldier maintained a position the math had rated as indefensible. I gave them every number first because I needed them to understand that I was not speaking from emotion, or from the particular distortion that dramatic events can create in a witness. I needed them to understand the math before I explained what the math had missed. The chamber was quiet through all of it. Then I said, I have commanded forces across 17 campaigns. I have developed, in that time, a reliable framework for assessing military capability. The framework is built on factors that can be measured: training levels, equipment quality, tactical doctrine, unit cohesion, command depth. These factors predict outcomes. They have served me well. They were wrong at Yeeson Prime. I paused. They were wrong not because the factors were incorrectly assessed, but because the framework was incomplete. It did not account for what I watched on the Karath Ridge. I described what I had watched. I was as precise as I had been with the numbers, because the description required precision if it was to convey what had actually happened, rather than a dramatic version of it. I described the heart rate monitoring. I described the anticipation of the flanking movement. I described the transition to the sidearm, and the use of the knife, and the specific quality of decision-making I had observed in every piece of telemetry data, and in the 11 seconds I had spent standing in front of her on the ridge. She was not different from the mathematical framework's predictions in the way that a better equipped or more experienced soldier would be different, I said. Her equipment was standard. Her rank and time in service were unremarkable by coalition standards. The difference was something that the framework does not currently have a category for. A delegate from the Drenhari bloc, an elder named Vorkesh, who had represented his species at conclave for over 2 centuries, raised a formal inquiry. Commander, Are you suggesting that human beings have a biological advantage we have not previously identified? No, I said. Or, not exactly. The advantage is not biological in the conventional sense. It is not a matter of stronger muscles or faster processing or superior sensory capability. The advantage is something that exists at the intersection of will and training, in the space between what the body is doing and what the mind is telling it to do. I had prepared for this question. I had thought about how to explain it for 6 weeks, since the day I left the medical bay after watching Dara Vasquez fall asleep in front of a viewport full of stars. The framework assumes, I said, that a rational being, facing certain failure, will accept the logic of that failure and act accordingly. Retreat, if retreat is possible. Attempt survival, rather than attempt the impossible. The framework is correct about most beings, most of the time. It is not correct about this one, and I believe it is not correct about this one, because this one, and I suspect, systematically, her species, has a different relationship to the concept of limits. I looked out across the chamber. The brood do not know fear, I said. They advance because they have no alternative to advancing. This is their source of power, and their fundamental limitation. They can only ever do one thing. They are a force, not an intelligence. They cannot adapt to a situation they have not encountered. They cannot choose. I let that sit for a moment. Sergeant Vasquez chose, I said. Every second on that ridge was a choice. Not the choice of someone who does not feel fear. She has been very clear, in subsequent conversations, that she was afraid. But the choice of someone who has learned that fear is information rather than instruction. That the body's report on a dangerous situation is not the same thing as the body's recommendation on what to do about it. I paused again. She told me that her grandmother taught her the body can do anything the mind refuses to stop. I have been thinking about that sentence for 6 weeks. I believe it is not simply a personal philosophy. I believe it is a cultural inheritance. I believe it is something that the human species has been developing, in various forms, across the entire length of their history, which is longer and harder, by most objective measures, than the history of any species currently in this chamber. They built their civilization on a world that tried to stop them, regularly, severely, and they kept building. The chamber was very quiet. We have described them as young, I said. They are young as a spacefaring species. They are not young as a species. They are ancient, and they are shaped by every difficult thing their world did to them, and the shape that produced is something we do not have an adequate framework for. I am recommending today that we build one. I then made 4 specific recommendations, each supported by the sensor data and the operational analysis, and the testimony of every coalition officer who had worked alongside human units in the past 11 years, which I had collected in the 6 weeks since Yisan Prime. The recommendations concerned integration of human units into coalition forward operations, revision of the capability assessments, establishment of a joint training framework, and, most significantly, elevation of the human coalition delegation's status from observer level to full operational partnership. I made the recommendations. I presented the supporting data. I stepped back from the podium. The debate lasted 3 hours. It was vigorous and detailed, and occasionally heated, and entirely appropriate for a decision of this significance. Several delegates raised concerns that were legitimate concerns, and deserved the responses I and my supporting staff provided. Several others raised concerns that were not quite concerns but were the political equivalent of adjustment time, the space that institutions require when they are being asked to revise a category rather than simply add information to it. I had expected all of it. What I had not expected was the Drenhari elder, Vorkesh. He had been one of the most skeptical voices in the preliminary discussions. His message to me, 48 hours before the session, had been the most careful and thorough challenge to my conclusions, and I had respected the care and thoroughness of it, even while disagreeing with every point it contained. He had been in the chamber for all 3 hours of debate, listening more than speaking, his secondary eyes watching the discussion, with the quality of attention that he brought to every significant decision in his centuries of service. When the debate resolved to a formal vote, he requested the floor. The chamber gave it to him. He stood. He was very old enough that the characteristic stillness of age had become, in him, something more like deliberateness. Everything he did was chosen. He spoke for 4 minutes. He spoke about the coalition's first years. about the early period, before most of the species in the chamber had joined, when the coalition was 2 species and an agreement, and the question of whether it would survive its first century was genuinely open. He spoke about the debates that had happened then, about who belonged and who could contribute, and what the standards should be for membership. He spoke about the ways in which those early debates had been wrong, not maliciously, not stupidly, but simply incompletely. The frameworks had been built from what was known, and they had not accounted for what was not yet understood. "We have made this error before," he said. "We have looked at a species and seen what they are, rather than what they are becoming. We have applied the present-day measure to a future-facing quantity. It is an understandable error. It is not one we are required to continue making." He turned, slightly, toward where the human delegation sat. Dara Vasquez was in the chamber. She had insisted on attending, and the Queen had supported the insistence, and the medical team had cleared her for the activity, with the admonition that she sit rather than stand, which she was doing, in the second row of the human delegation's seating, with the regenerative cast still on her left arm, and the Serath Commendation, awarded in a private ceremony 3 days earlier by the Queen herself, on the front of her formal uniform. She was not performing anything. She was simply present, the way she was always simply present, with the dark eyes moving, and the posture of someone who is paying attention to everything simultaneously. Vorkesh looked at her. "We underestimated you," he said. It was not a formal conclave statement. It did not follow the protocol of conclave address. It was simply the truth, said directly, with the weight of 2 centuries of experience behind it, and the humility of a being who had been wrong about something significant and was choosing not to be politic about it. The chamber was completely silent. Dara Vasquez met his gaze. "Yeah," she said. "They always do." 3 words. Not defensive, not triumphant, just accurate. The quiet certainty of someone who has been underestimated long enough to know the pattern, and who has stopped needing the pattern to change before she acts within it. The vote passed. Not unanimously. 5 delegations abstained for reasons of procedural caution rather than substantive opposition, which is the way significant decisions often pass in the coalition. But it passed, and the framework changes I had recommended were approved for immediate implementation, and the human delegation's status was elevated with effect from the session date. The chamber dissolved into the organized movement that follows a significant vote, delegates in conversation, staff exchanging documents, the low-frequency hum of an institution processing a change. I made my way through it to where the human delegation was seated. Dara was talking to one of her delegation's senior officers, a tall man named Oliver Grant, who had been with the coalition mission long enough to have attended 6 previous conclave sessions, and who wore the expression of someone watching history happen and finding that it looks different than they expected. She looked up when I approached. "Commander," she said. "The vote passed," I said. "I heard. I wanted to thank you." She raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For being on the ridge," I said. "For not accepting the conclusion. For finding the 3 minutes." I paused. "For being the thing the math missed." She was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't there to change the coalition," she said. "I was there because the Queen needed more time, and nobody else was staying." "I know," I said. "That is precisely what changed the coalition." She thought about that. "Commander," she said, "you came back to the ridge." "Yes. In your command shuttle. In a brood contact zone." That still was not the rational choice. "No," I agreed. "It was not. And you've spent 6 weeks arguing in front of an 81-delegate chamber that the rational choice is not always the right choice." "Yes." She looked at me with an expression that I had, by this point, enough familiarity with to read. It was the expression of someone who finds the consistency of a position both satisfying and amusing. "Maybe," she said, "you had more in common with us than the framework was accounting for." I thought about that, about 40 years of military command, and the decisions I had made at the margins of what the math said, and the moments where the rational choice had been visible to me and I had chosen something adjacent to it, about the 17 campaigns, and the ones that had been won because someone on my staff or in my units had looked at the impossible and found the gap. "Perhaps," I said. She nodded. "My grandmother would have liked you." "On the basis of available information," I said. I believe I would have found her remarkable. The corner of her mouth moved, the beginning of a smile. She was, she said. I am writing this account now, 2 years after Yisun Prime, as part of the broader Coalition historical record, and as part of my own effort to understand what I witnessed and why it matters. The Coalition has changed in those 2 years, not radically, not overnight, but in the way that genuine understanding changes things, which is deep and slow and ultimately more durable than the changes that happen quickly. Human units are integrated into forward operations across 7 active theaters. The Joint Training Framework is in its 2nd year, and the early assessments are consistent with what I observed on the Karath Ridge. Human soldiers bring something to combined operations that augments the capabilities of every species they work alongside, not because of superior equipment or superior training in any conventional sense, but because of the quality of presence they maintain under pressure. The word I have begun using in my operational reports is anchor. They are anchors. Not because they are immovable, they adapt constantly, better than most species I have observed in the field, but because there is a point in every engagement where the math becomes unfavorable and the rational choice becomes retreat, and the human units consistently find the gap between what the math says and what is actually possible, and they hold it, and the holding changes what everyone else can do. 211. The number on the Karath Ridge. It is not a large number in the context of the brood advance. It did not significantly reduce the brood's operational capacity. It was not a victory. It was a gap. 3 minutes made real. A queen alive and a coalition intact, and a room full of delegates revising their frameworks because one person refused to accept the conclusion. I have a different word for sacrifice now, not one of the 17 Vethari terms, which I have found are all too specific and too final for what I am trying to describe. The word I use now is gap finding. It is not elegant and it is not traditional, but it is accurate. She found the gap. That is the entire story. Everything else, the vote, the framework revision, the joint operations, the Sarath commendation, the slow change in how 40 species understand one. Everything else is what happens when you find the gap, and you hold it long enough for the rest of the universe to come through. I keep, in my personal log, a record of the telemetry readings from the Karath Ridge. Heart rate, respiratory rate, the moments of impact and the continuation after each one. The numbers that tell the story of what happens inside a being who has decided that the limit is further out than everyone else believes. 58 beats per minute. That number means something to me that I cannot fully translate into language. It means the body can do anything the mind refuses to stop. It means someone had to. It means the math was missing something. It means she found the 3 minutes, and the 3 minutes were enough, and the enough was everything. The brood are still out there. The war continues. It will continue for some time. These things do not resolve quickly, and the brood do not negotiate, and do not withdraw, and do not change. They advance until they are stopped, and stopping them requires exactly the kind of presence that I watched on the Karath Ridge. The kind of presence that stays when the rational thing is to leave, and finds the gap in the impossible, and holds it. We have more of that presence now. We have it in every theater and every forward position, and every combined unit in the coalition fleet. The galaxy is learning what to do with it. 40 species, and counting. And somewhere in the rotation, in whatever active theater she has been assigned to since her arm healed and her medical clearance came through, Sergeant First Class Dara Vasquez is doing what she always does, paying attention to everything, running the numbers, finding the gap that the numbers missed, and being the thing the math did not account for. She is not doing it to change the galaxy. She is doing it because someone has to. And that is exactly why it changes everything.